and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Scrivener. Is your word processor holding you back? Are you constantly breaking your flow to search your computer for vital notes or research? If so, Scrivener can help.
Scrivener is a best-selling app tailor-made for writers, combining all the tools you'll need to craft your first draft. However you write, Scrivener molds to fit your style. Plan everything first or just get writing, and restructure later using the app's integrated outlining tools. Got a good idea but don't know where it fits? Write when inspiration strikes, then find its place later.
Rearrange your plot on virtual index cards in Scrivener's corkboard, or work with an overview of a chapter, a part, or even your whole manuscript using Scrivener's outliner. Break chapters into shorter, more manageable sections, and then edit them in isolation or as a whole.
In Scrivener, you'll find everything you need to get writing and keep writing. Find out why it's the favourite app of best-selling writers and aspiring authors alike by taking the 30-day free trial, or use the code TAKENOTES before 20th of June for a 20% discount on Scrivener for macOS or Windows at www.scrivener.com.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the novelist and non-fiction author Andrew O'Hagan.
We spoke to Andrew about coming to London from Scotland and making his way, about combining journalism and fiction, and about his latest novel, Caledonian Road.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Andrew, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with Caledonian Road, your latest novel? You got the idea in the National Portrait Gallery, but how did it come about?
Actually, it's very seldom that a book sort of manifests from a state of exhaustion, but I think in a way this one did, because I'd been working with Julian Assange for a year. He'd asked me to help him write his memoirs, and so there was a long hurly-burly about that involving house arrest and asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, and I was in there for a long time with him. Anyway, that came to an end, and I was just sort of decompressing, I suppose is the word, gathering myself after that experience. And I happened to be in town, and I went into the National Gallery, and I wanted to look at the Vermeers. I had an idea that this big social novel was kind of percolating in my head, and just was feeling forward with it. And I went into the room where the Vermeers are at the National Gallery, and standing right next to them, there was a rather tall, elegant Scotsman, unmistakably Scottish, speaking to a young student with a backpack. And just the language and the sort of slight aggression between them, and the sense of sort of generational warfare going on between this very self-appointed white expert, this professor who knew about Dutch art and the golden period of Dutch art, and he was talking to this young man with such a sense of ownership of the culture and of civilization, and the young man was coming back at him, undermining him. And I just thought, in that snapshot with the Vermeer over their shoulder, suddenly the whole novel, the whole of Caledonian Road sort of came to life in my head at that point, and I knew I would have a character like that man at the centre of the book, who turns out to be Campbell Flynn, the central character. And there would be a student of his who comes to be Milo Mangasha in the novel. So it came from this strange place where I was looking to, populate this novel that had been in my head in some ways, but suddenly it had flesh and blood. I've never, of course, seen those people again, but I suppose I owe them some sort of debt.
And this idea of writing a kind of big state of the city novel, in the commentary since it's come out, there have been comparisons with Bonfire of the Vanities, also with Dickens. Were you sure right from the beginning that this was like a big London thing that you were going to do?
Yes, absolutely. From that very first set of notes that I made 10 years ago about what the novel might be, I was drawing on Dickens, and I was thinking about, I suppose the tradition of the great social novel. That's to say, a novel which tries to cover society and all its economic and social differences, that it tries to herd them all onto the page without fear or favour. I was beginning to research into worlds, some of which were quite alien to me, like the world of the aristocracy in Britain, their polo games and their balls and their suppers and their, their meets. I went to the polo at Windsor one particular day, and the Queen was throwing a lunch, and I managed to sort of get my myself in there. And there were Japanese and Russian businessmen and oligarchs and all sorts of people mingling with these members of the English aristocracy. And that became kind of manna from the gods for the novel. And I realised, even at that point, that I was going to have to find a way to mix that with the evidence I was finding in other areas of my research, working with corrupt businessmen and with actors, and in the fashion world with models and designers, and with street gangs, these drill rap gangs that I'd got in touch with. All of them were beginning to take their place, not only in Caledonian Road, the novel, but in Caledonian Road, the physical space in the book. And so the interconnectedness of these people became the driving force of the whole project for me.
You use the term social novel. Do you prefer that to State of the Nation novel? And if so, why?
I think I do. There's something about State of the Nation suggests that you're kind of answerable to the news in a way that I don't think novels need to feel, reactive in that way. Although I was very concerned as I was writing this book to make sure that a lot of the great energies of state, great changes to do with, asylum seekers and Brexit and the pandemic, I actually knitted them in to the narrative, re-knitted the narrative several times to accommodate some of these big changes. But at the same time, I didn't feel that the novel had to be, if you like, loyal to everything that was happening in the news. It felt like a social novel in the sense that the characters and their inner lives, if you like, their interconnectedness to each other also would outlive, if you like, the news. And I think that's something you take from Dickens and Trollope and Elizabeth Gaskell as well, the great Victorian social novelist, teaches that, yes, it can be responding, the story, to what's going on in the society of their day, but it should transcend it in some way. I think readers know how to pick up on that they weren't enslaved to the news cycle, and I didn't want them to be. So, yeah, I think that's the reason why I prefer social novel. It just gives a bit more freedom.
And there's been a kind of trend in the culture over the last decade or so, this idea that only members of a certain community have a right to write about them or so forth. And this seems in some ways a quite kind of joyful riposte to that. You made, a lot of very funny stuff about academic culture and stuff like that. But was that, again, a kind of conscious decision that you were going to push a bit against that trend, or is it just how it emerged?
It's a really good question, that, because it goes to the heart of the kind of creative effort with a book like this. You have to be a bit fearless if you're going to try and throw your net wide across a society and pull in as much human detail and as much sort of churn of human relations as you can. That means that the culture wars, so-called, are going to come into it. And you can't be frightened of that. I think novelists should get over themselves and when it comes to feeling that they have to be identity mongerers and sort of, express their own identity all the time and their own loyalty to what they know or what they're privileged to know. I don't have much truck with any of that. I think novelists are wallflowers. We're at the dance and we're watching, and we're mainly apart from the drama but seeing it clearly. And human relations are fascinating, and they're there to be absorbed by novelists and gifted back to the readers, as far as I'm concerned. And so from the very beginning, I just sort of threw myself into this idea that there were going to be parts of society appearing in this novel that weren't natively mine. There were going to be people from cultures and walks of life that were, not first person experienced by me, but I've always held the view, not just because I enjoy the Victorians, but I enjoy it today with many novelists with a wide freelance imagination, that it's a novelist's job to not appropriate, as is the accusatory word of the moment, not to appropriate, but to empathise right across their society and right across humanness. The art of the novel is the art of empathy, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why readers love the novels they love so much, because the writers of them, hopefully, bring them into company with situations and plots and humanness that they might otherwise not have met before. So you've got to be an equal opportunities imaginer, of course, and take a lot of trouble and not do too much guessing about how people speak and what their cultural values are. You've got to immerse yourself at the deepest level in order to earn that empathy. But still, I would maintain that that's possible. And certainly it's what I've enjoyed about a lot of the writers over the years that I've loved, is that deep power of connection they manage to force with people who aren't themselves.
Tell us a little bit about how you immersed yourself in the kinds of groups and people and experiences that you were writing about in the novel.
It would possibly surprise you and surprise listeners to learn that, some of the groups that you would think were hardest to get into are actually easier. For example, those rather exclusive worlds of Russian oligarchs or, corrupt business people or the royal family, they're actually relatively approachable because they understand the world of writing and public relations and publicity, They live in a kind of universe where they want to give a version of themselves to history and to current affairs. So writers are kind of attractive to them. They make a place at the table for, the witness, the recorder, the writer. And so I found it relatively easy to get into those worlds. I mean, I'm not sure that they would feel that they were rewarded by giving me access, but I knew that I was writing a sort of comedy of manners. As far as I'm concerned, at the fundament of the British novel especially is comedy. If you look back to not only Dickens, but Henry Fielding and Jane Austen, and, the real sort of energy in the formation of the social novel in Britain is comic. So I wanted to get in among them and found it quite easy to get in among those people who had a version of themselves that they wanted to sell. The much harder groups to gain access to are like street gangs. People in subcultures where they're like, I don't have any interest in speaking to you. This middle-aged white guy comes along with his notepad and they're like, what do you want? And I had to, show a bit of perseverance there and also a bit of interest. It might sound like a no-brainer, but curiosity and fundamental interestedness in the part of the writer gets you a long, long way. Even the most die-hard refusenik can eventually sort of surrender, perhaps, to a little bit of genuine interest. And the younger people in the novel that, gave me inspiration and gave me information and language, they became approachable and became kind of part of my, research because I think they responded to the fact that I was just really, really interested in their lives, their experience, their music, where they'd been, who their families were, what their community was, what the postcode obsession was, all of it. They sort of gave me so much in the end, and but it was tough at the beginning because they have no publicity sort of antennae in the way that I think self-interested business people might. It was really an interesting 10 years worth of research because sometimes there's a lot of costume changes involved, I can tell you that. You'd start the day off in a pair of trainers and a puffer jacket and end it in a 14-piece suit, as far as I can remember. It was laugh out loud territory very often.
Another question that we always put to novelists on this show is whether they pre-organise their plots, so whether they know where it's all going to go in advance, or whether they kind of dive in and follow. And with this, and more generally with your work, where were you situated? And then also, it's a long book. Were you always thinking it was going to be a sort of 600-pager?
Actually, what I was amazed by was the necessity of it being that length, because I haven't written, by habit, long books. I mean, this is my 10th book, and many of those are novels. And I tended towards the sort of, the tidy, smaller narrative with a few characters, a sort of chamber piece, if you like. But I knew from early in my research that this was going to be the full orchestra. The timpani and the trombones were going to be brought on stage for this one very necessarily because there were just so many characters from so many different walks of life, and their interconnectedness would take time to reveal to the reader. This is, as people have commented on, it's a bit of a page turner. This people really want to know how it turns out, and so did I, by the way. I was running to the desk when I was writing that first draft just to find out what was going to happen myself. Because although I had a plan, and you ask about plans, I mean, I did have a big board, a big felt board, 6 feet by 6 feet, taking up the whole of one of the walls in my study. And it was full of typed cards, little index cards, which detailed what was happening in each chapter and gave cross-references right across the whole expanse of the novel. And yet, in the life of every novelist and in every novel, there's always surprises. And it's opening yourself up to the possibility of surprise that is part of the creative game, if you like. Anybody who's serious about fiction knows that you can have the best map in the world. You could be driving by a kind of internal sat-nav creatively, and yet suddenly your eye just catches a fox in a forest some way off to the left, and some snow on the mountains beyond, and a lake that you didn't account for, off to the right. I mean, that is what it's like. You run into little surprises, and sometimes they change the book or change a character's destiny within a story. So you've got to be alert. You're not just slavishly following your plan. The plan's a sort of, a menu of possibilities, really. And they just keep you steady. But I found very often when I was writing Caledonian Road that a person just wouldn't go where I expected them to go, and they almost talked back at me in a way that I had to then, accommodate and control. So it was exciting work that way, a big novel finally, after years of wanting to write one. And, the response has been so pleasing because people do, they do have a feel sort of almost internally for the big Victorian style story where the outcome isn't known. And only in the very last page, in the very last line of Caledonian Road, do you really land at a place of full understanding about what has happened.
I've just spied on the wall behind you. You have a sign that says Caledonian Road. Did that pre or post date the novel?
That predated the novel, actually. I got that. I used to live near Caledonian Road, and I always thought it was a wonderful name for a road. And when I lived at King's Cross, I'd often be there, and I was struck by what a multicultural, kind of multifarious, big London road Caledonian Road happened to be. So I sort of stored that away in the way you do, squirrel things into your notes and into your memory as a novelist, and I knew that one day, with a bit of luck, I would return to that title. So I bought that old bus sign and had it framed, and it was a bit of a talisman, if you like, for all those years. When I was writing the book, I'd sort of glance over my shoulder and see that it was there. So, it's one of those things, I'm sure previous guests have hinted at this, but, it's an overwhelming experience putting something into the world that wasn't there before, in terms of a big novel, that I can still remember sitting at this very desk when it was just a huge heap of blank pages. I always do my first draft in a combination of longhand and old typewriter. And, I was winding the pages in blank, one after one, to all the way through to 850 pages of manuscript. It was just a sort of amazing head fuck, really, to see this thing assemble from my notes and my plan on the board and my research, which had been kind of crazy and voluminous by the end. But the blank pages I'll never forget. They're just going to remain blank until you do something about that. And, you do feel at the end that some sort of overwhelming magic has occurred. I'm not making a comment about the quality or not of the book, just the experience of getting it down, When I have students, the thing that most overwhelms them is the idea of getting it down. Lots of you have great ideas for a book, have amazing experience, know things that the rest of us don't know. There'll be things that each of you know that I'll just never know. And the question then is getting it down, organising it, somehow bringing it out. And, oh my God, with Caledonian Road, I just felt that the task was so giant that there were moments along the way where I thought, maybe this will never actually occur. Maybe it's too much, So there's a bit of celebration, a bit of breaking open of a bottle of whiskey when you finally get there.
We wanted to come back to Caledonian Road in due course, but can we roll back now to your early life and maybe do this through a scene in another of your books? So in Mayflies, there's this great moment where the character, who I suppose is a bit of a cipher for you, goes for a job interview at a yard where they make fence posts, and the guy asks why you've got a copy of a Sartre book in your pocket. Can you take us back to your early life, the Milo that you're growing up in, and where your interest in books and writing kind of fitted in and developed there?
I was one of those kids who grew up in a house where there were no books. It was the local library that absolutely captivated me at a very young age. My late father, by the way, once heard me say this about there being no books in our house, and he rang me up and he said, You told a lie on the radio last night. You said there were no books in our house growing up. Well, there was one. It was green. It was on top of the fridge for ages. I said, that was the Kilmarnock Telephone Directory. That doesn't count as a book. But it was one of those houses, where there just wasn't reading going on. There was a lot of music happening and a lot of telly going on. So the local library became a kind of refuge for me. And I just became one of those kids who always had a book on the go, walking down the street or stuck into the blazer pocket, on the bus. I was always bumping into lampposts or, into walls because I was that kid, who'd practically read every book in the library by the time I was 16. And it gave me a grounding, I suppose, and a kind of mad enthusiasm for what could be done with the human mind, what could be done with language, and I've been pursuing it ever since. You're never finished as an apprentice, by the way. You're still always reading another new take, experiencing another voice, hearing another way of doing it. You're the perpetual apprentice in this game, except you do gain some sort of professional experience along the way. And so you come out of the trap faster. You know technically how to get people in and out of a room. All that comes with time. But my early days were just about examining it. I remember looking at Dickens and thinking, how did he get that to happen? How did he get that bit of personal history to appear out of the past, just right onto the page in the middle of a scene? That was always fascinating to me, just how human experience can be manifested in sentences. And so whether it was Muriel Spark or George Eliot or Norman Mailer or Truman Capote, I was always examining it. Sometimes even as a kid, as a really young kid, I'd type out other people's stories on an old typewriter just to get the feel for the mechanics of their sentences. I think when I was about 12, this is real get a life moment, I think I typed out the whole of Solzhenitsyn's Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich one summer. Just every day I typed out more of it, and it gave me such a sort of rhythm for his prose. And I just loved being a kid learning all that stuff. I felt that it would be useful to me in life. Boringly, I suppose I was one of those kids who really knew what they wanted to do, and I never veered from the track. Never really, no.
Were there ever times when you were typing that out where you were like, might stop doing this now? Or did you have confidence in that as a project and what it would teach you?
Much worse, actually. There were times in the typing it out where I began to think, maybe I could slightly tinker with this sentence. That's how arrogant and how self-deluded you can be as a young budding writer. That's when I knew I was ready to write my own thing. I was like, this sentence is a bit long. These paragraphs are a bit long-winded. I think we could cut to the chase here. I think there's something to be said for it. I wouldn't advocate it, generally speaking, to creative writing students around the world, but I would say that sometimes really examining the mechanics of another writer's prose, if you're a prose writer or indeed a poet, just typing out poems and looking at the choices and the decisions that the writer made to have the turn here, to end a line there, to break the stanza at that moment. Why? And you find out when you're really inside it. So, the arrogant youth in me wanted to renovate all that writing eventually. And I suppose that is what you're doing when you're writing your own book. You're kind of renovating all the writers that you've enjoyed before. You're kind of trying to keep up with them and go one better, if you like. That's part of the joy of it all.
Hello listeners, you may remember that a few months ago we made some improvements to our Patreon offering, refreshing our package of successful pitches for people who support Always Take Notes. Since then, we've been so delighted to see more people join up. We've loved hearing from you about how useful you found the package and the podcast, but we're really keen to keep expanding the benefits available to all the people who support us.
So with that in mind, we've added 40 new pages of material to the package, including pitches to the New York Times, the Washington Post and the BBC. This means the whole compendium now runs to a whopping 160 pages. And we're excited to announce that for people who contribute $10 a month, we're also going to start releasing bonus mini episodes. If you'd like to know what these will sound like, there's a sample episode with Lee Child that you can listen to for free on our Patreon now.
Thanks to the help of our sponsor, Scrivener, the first 10 new sign-ups at $10 per month will receive a lifelong license to Scrivener worth £55. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, academic papers, and even scripts. But we only have 10 to give out, so if you're interested, please check it out as soon as you can.
These are just a few of the updates we've made to our Patreon offering. So if you'd like to find out more about how to get your hands on an ATN mug, suggest questions for upcoming guests, or join a monthly call with us to workshop a pitch, head to www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes. That's www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes.
And thanks so much again for all your support so far. Can you tell us about how you went about making your way? So we saw that, you're 21, you get a bus from Glasgow down to London with 60 quid in your pocket, a place to sleep on your friend Alan's floor. And then, in terms of getting into the LRB, take us back to this period in your life when you were starting to find your path.
Do you know, one of the things they say, which is annoying but also true, and probably annoying because true, is that youth is slightly wasted on the young. And the only way in which I can actually visualise that as a possible truth is when I think about my earliest days in London, because you're so young and so fresh and so free in a way from a lot of the big concerns that come later in life, concerns to do with, mortgages and children maybe, and, deadlines and career choices. That's not quite happened yet. What's happening is that you're tossing about in London, sleeping on your friend's floor, and it doesn't matter that you're skint, as long as you've got enough for a pint or to go for a swim or to buy a book. That's the position I was in. And I'm looking at it now as a period of immense freedom, the kind of freedom that I never really got again. I got other sorts of freedom, and I was delighted with that and delighted to move on. But that little golden period at the beginning when you've just graduated, you're young, you could try things out. And I worked in bars and I read a lot, and I started to write stories and reportage and submit it to places. And I got a job at the London Review of Books quite young. I was in there when I was 21. And it was an amazing office because they some of the best editors and most imaginative writers in the country, in the world actually. At that time, Hilary Mantel and Martin Amis and Jenny Diskey and Susan Sontag, they were all writing for the paper. Frank Commode, the great critic, they were all submitting pieces day after day. And I was there as a young editor, learning the trade. And it was astonishing to have that as a kind of zone of apprenticeship. And it made a writer out of me. Actually, I'd wanted to be one and I'd been on the case, but it sharpened all my instincts. It taught me how to edit, how to be harsh about, excess material, how to do fact-checking, how to really drill down on a subject. I became a reporter on that literary paper, the London Review of Books, without any training as a journalist. I had no shorthand, I had no legal training. But then suddenly I was writing these 10,000, 12,000 word, articles, big pieces of reportage. And then from there I was offered a contract with The Guardian and I started writing for them. And then over the years, The New Yorker and other places. And I did that in parallel with writing books. I published my first book, which was a non-fiction book, really grew out of that reportage and also of my young life, a book called The Missing, which was really the story of this new attention that was falling on the idea of missing people. Suddenly in the 90s, there was this cult of the missing. Missing children had always been an issue, right back to Victorian times and long before that. But suddenly there was this new focus on it, and there was posters everywhere of missing people. And so I wrote The Missing as a kind of way to try and explain a contemporary atmosphere, a kind of social decay, if you like, in the book. It really launched me, It was a strong beginning for me because everybody sort of seemed to respond to that book at the time.
How did that book come about in terms of the kind of proposal, getting an agent, shipping it to publishers, all of that side of things?
Do you know, it would be much more respectable if I told you a story of how I'd starved in the garret and sort of wrote 55 drafts and they were all rejected 1,000 times. That's more typical, but I have to be really honest with you and say that, it all fell together really quickly and in a kind of dreamlike way for me. I wrote an article for the London Review of Books about a very striking case of child murder that happened in Liverpool. You may have heard of in 1993, the murder of a boy, James Bulger, by two 10-year-olds. It became a kind of internationally transfixing case of these two 10-year-old boys who were then subjected to a sort of adult trial, and the question of their innocence and their guilt became, front and centre for all of us. There was a big moral debate about those boys and about life in Liverpool and about childhood itself. And anyway, I wrote an autobiographical piece about growing up in a housing estate in Scotland in the 70s and 80s, and it just overnight kind of created a huge sort of debate around itself. And I was offered publishing contracts on the back of that piece that was in the London Review. The London Review has always been a bit of a shop window for emerging talent. It still is. People often publish one piece or one or two pieces there, and suddenly publishers and agents are on top of them. It's great to see that magazines can still have that power. I'm a great fan of my magazines. They've been part of my adult life all the way through. But anyway, I got an agent and a publisher very quickly from that piece in the LRB, and started writing The Missing that month, actually, and published it within a year.
I read that piece before we spoke, and I found it was very powerful. And also, I think there's a profile of you in The Guardian that talks about how your phone didn't stop ringing for a year afterwards. I was just wondering, looking back to a pre-internet and pre-social media time, how did that? It was clearly a kind of viral piece, but before that was a thing. How did it kind of work in those days? Was it, what made it? What were the channels and the mechanisms that really made it get a hit? Was it the fact it was in the LRB? And I suppose, does that have any bearing on your decision now to not be on social media, as it were?
It's such a fascinating question, that, Simon, because actually it has changed so much. I mean, nowadays, it would simply become a phenomenon on social media. It'd be repeatedly shared, on social media in a way that caused everybody to link and read the piece. But then it was a kind of word of mouth phenomenon. I mean, you mentioned the thing about the phone started to ring. That's really true. The phone in my desk started ringing, and it rang and rang and rang all day for the best part of a year, with people either, wanting to reproduce that piece. So The Guardian reprinted it, and then Harper's in America reprinted it. The New York Times took an interest in it, and it started to be republished again and again, that piece. And then other debates grew up around it, and I was drawn into just countless radio and television interviews across the world. Things became viral in a very different way than what, as you say, the word viral didn't mean anything then, but anything non-medical, that's to say. But it did become famous, the piece, and I was drawn into it very, very quickly. And I was invited onto every platform to talk about it. And by the time I published my first book, I was already well known for that piece. So The Missing wasn't published as a first book into a vacuum. It was published into a kind of a ready-made audience for that book, because of the interest that people had shown in the non-fiction writing I'd done before that. So it was a very different publishing and writing scene, but it worked very well in the sense that a whole community of readers and writers and editors and publishers and broadcasters could kind of throw their arms around a new writer or a new subject or even a single piece and sort of promote it endlessly, and it's amazing to think of how different it is now. But when that happened, then it kind of took you by surprise. You didn't have a phone in your pocket. You'd go home to messages on your answer phone and a kind of blinking light in the corner of your flat. I mean, it was a really phenomenal first experience of all that. And the second part of your question, I think it captivates me too, because I'm quite shy of things like Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, because I think then you become too caught up potentially in commentary rather than in creating pieces of writing. Short commentaries and blurbs and responses, I think, aren't the main business of professional writers. I think you should be in a quiet corner using all the caution and imagination, but also, if you like, patience that you have at your disposal to be very careful about what you write and to be very dedicated to getting it as right and as alive as it can possibly be. And I don't think that describes social media. I think it's too fast, it's too angry, it's too shouty, it's too instantly responsive. And that obviously has its place in the world and lots of people love it. I don't love it. Consideration and rumination are much more what I'm into. And I like Instagram because Instagram's, fun photographs and, sharing sort of high notes and comedy and, sharing your good news with people. So I'm into Instagram and I love being on it. But the other ones I find, it's like a perpetual press conference and a perpetual pub argument. And I just don't see myself in there.
I'm sure lots of listeners would share your feelings on that. Perhaps with reference to this piece or any other that you've written for the LRB, could you put your finger on what it is that makes an LRB piece versus perhaps a New Yorker one or anything else that, of that length?
Again, it fascinates me that because, it's something I've lived with now for 3 decades. I can't believe they've passed so quickly. But I went, as I said, in my early 20s, and 3 decades on, I'm still absolutely caught up in a kind of fascination with what makes, the essay in English. It is a particular form, and I've been a fan of it. I loved people like William Hazlitt, the great romantic essayist, Charles Lamb, and through the 20th century, I always loved those George Orwell essays, those Joan Didion essays. I've been a fan of the essay all my life. In places like The New Yorker and especially, to my mind, the London Review, which keeps that tradition alive and brings fresh oxygen to the form all the time. In terms of what actually makes an LRB essay distinct, I think it's 2 things. On the one hand, it's a slight kind of DNA of humour. I mean, there's great essays in many publications, including the New York Review, and as I say, the New Yorker, a brilliant magazine. That has humour too, but it's especially, I think, often British, the humour in the LRB. It's not just a piss take, it's a kind of self-deprecating, tongue-in-cheek, the writer not taking themselves 100% seriously all the time. It opens up to a kind of absurdity. That's point 1. Point 2, what I'd think of as the characteristic LRB ambivalence. The best LRB pieces, in my view, are never overly invested in what the writer thinks to be the case. It's open to the idea that the very opposite might also be the case too. So ambivalence, ambiguity, two-mindedness, whatever you want to call it, the LRB is very good at sort of not hobby-horsing. People aren't sort of stridently just stating and restating their strong position. Other papers do that, and they do it relentlessly, and they blame people who don't believe what they believe. The LRB doesn't really do that. It has taken some pretty strong positions here and there, but at its best, I think what it does is it opens up the possibility that even when things seem very provably true, it's humanly interesting and somewhat enlightening to open up the opposite view as well. Open up weaknesses in our own definite sense of truth. The LRB has a kind of capacity to open its lungs and sort of breathe a bit more freely in that way. It's not afraid, its best writers aren't afraid of upsetting people by not towing the line. Towing the line has never been the LRB's instinct, I don't think. Whether it be on the miners' strike, which of course I felt outraged at the time that it wasn't being pro-Arthur Scargill enough, but it was being open to the idea that maybe the miners were being led down the wrong path. During the Falklands, it went very much against the Tory government and the Labour Party, which supported the Tory government in that action in the Falklands in 1982 against the Argentinians, which led to hundreds of deaths. Or whether it be on the influence of the Israeli lobby in America, or on the position of Julian Assange, a subject that I took up myself, and WikiLeaks. It doesn't take a predictable position on these things, but just tries to, without forcing it, just to open up the reader's mind to the sort of multiplicity of possibilities around the subject.
Just expanding on that, could you tell us about Assange, how it came about and how it progressed, and then, how the piece that you ended up publishing came about and landed?
Well, that was an interesting one for me because it became a piece by default. I mean, a 30,000 word piece by default, as it turned out. But originally, my task was to help Assange write his memoir. He'd contacted me, and his people had contacted me to come and meet him when he was under house arrest in Norfolk in around 2011. And I went there with a very open mind. I had never been a ghostwriter. I've never been since. It's not really something that I was looking to do. But his world and the work that WikiLeaks was doing, the way it was intervening on government lies and military secrets, I thought was really important work. So I did want to find out more. And when I went down there, I was immediately struck by him and by his coterie, and I took on the task of helping him. So I was there for a whole year practically, in and out of that story, trying to help him get his story straight. As it turned out, it was a much more human problem than I'd first imagined it would be, because Assange despite being the kind of world prince of revealing people's secrets, he was rather shy when it came to telling his own secrets. And that was a kind of Shakespearean-sized irony at the centre of his life and at the centre of that story. So he tried to kill the book, whilst being perfectly friendly to me. He resisted his publisher's efforts to get it between covers, his agents, foreign publishers. He really resisted the whole effort he'd signed up for. And at that point, I began to document his resistance and to look at the question of ghosting and the question of this man's relationship with privacy and the truth. I started looking at it in a much more subjective way and telling a first-person account of what my experience, my eyewitnessing of his refusal and the media's kind of use of him and his manipulation by different forces and his manipulation of them. All of that became very alive to me in my own notepad, and I realised that I had to slightly separate myself from my original task and write this piece, which I did for the London Review. And I said it was a big piece, and it became a kind of reported piece. It involved my sort of separation from him. He'd already sort of thrown off the book, and he wanted to have a kind of different kind of relationship with people like me, where I would help him with his other work. But I returned to my first position, really, which was as a writer, and wrote about the experience I'd just had with him.
Did he try and stop the piece that you were writing for the LRB?
He did, yeah. I mean, he was very keen to stop it. He made contact with me when he heard that I was giving a lecture that would herald the piece, the LRB Winter Lecture Series, then at the British Museum that year in 2013. I mean, I waited quite a long time before doing it, but the week that the piece was coming out, I gave a lecture at the British Museum as part of that series, and he heard it was coming, and he called me and tried to persuade me not to do it. I think he felt that this would be somehow damaging to him. Well, I didn't really take a position on that. It's not my job to sift, people's self-consciousness or public relations, or to work out what is or isn't helpful to a person in their view of themselves. I just tried to tell the truth as I found it. And, it was all verifiable. It was all checkable. And, I was an eyewitness, and I tried to be a reliable witness. I wasn't interested in any way of taking him down. I still believed largely in the project that WikiLeaks was engaged in. And I certainly thought that the Americans, under the Espionage Act, were committing a crime themselves by trying to silence him. I thought that he had, abundant rights and protections under freedom of speech. And I stood by him in all the arguments that I was invited in on about whether he should be prosecuted or not. I certainly felt he should not. But there were other issues that he was facing on the international scene at that time, which he was less forthcoming about. And so it was very hard to wholeheartedly jump to his defence on every occasion. But the piece, again, had a comic centre. It was a kind of historically typical LRB piece in that way, that it was both for him and questioning of him. Plus, it was both very serious and, at its core, slightly comic, because there was a kind of carry-on film at the centre of all that spying, which I hope somehow made its way into the piece. So, the LRB was definitely the right venue to publish that piece in.
Just moving on a bit, it's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it's interacted with people's writing lives. And I thought it was an interesting question to have with you, because in Caledonian Road, it's such a theme and things like that. But I suppose there's a couple of parts of this. So on the LRB itself, is it still largely funded by Mary Kay Wilmer's money? And then secondly, for you as a writer and as you've generally sort of made your way, how has it worked financially with the different bits of work that you're doing and stuff like that?
Well, the LRB from very early in its life, back to 1980, has been funded by a trust that Mary Kay Wilmer's the former editor and co-founder of the London Review, who had a long distinguished career as an editor before she came to the LRB, both at the TLS and before that at Faber and Faber, a very visionary editor along with Carl Miller, her colleague and co-founder. Had early in the paper's life become the backer of the magazine, and her family come in very generously and have supported the paper through the decades. It's one of the great acts of philanthropy in British literary life in the late 20th and into the 21st century, in my view. So that allowed that magazine to go on and to be published every fortnight for now nearly 45 years without, certainly in the last 30 years, without any government assistance or any other commercial backup. So it's a fantastic story in that way. And I was very proud now for these last 20 years or so as a board member at the London Review to encourage that and to help manage that relationship, which, as I say, has been a wonderful one. As far as I go, as a writer and contributing editor to the paper for many years and now editor at large, I've found that the paper's kept alive my instinct to write reportage and write essays through all of my adult career. That's to say, they support me. I'm on a retainer there. It allows me to dedicate much more time to writing essays and big pieces of reportage and now podcasts. I did one recently, big series on the sinking of the Belgrano in the Falklands crisis for the LRB, and all these things come under the umbrella of the work that I do for them. And it's been marvellous to be able to do that in what feels like an old-fashioned New Yorker style staff writer capacity. The New Yorker still has, and always did have, a battalion of writers who were on staff, as it were, to turn their hand to producing material for that magazine. In the paper has a handful now of people who work under those conditions, and very happy conditions they are too, I must say. It's allowed me time to do these pieces. They often take a hell of a long time. I spent a whole year working on a giant piece about the Grenfell Tower fire, and that piece took over my life for over a year, and that couldn't have been done without the backing of the LRB, such as I've enjoyed. And working alongside my life as an author of books, well, it's just a perfect balance, actually. I must say it works really fruitfully together.
Is there an expectation of your output for the LRB, and kind of more broadly, how do you manage your time between that and your books?
I'm always up against it. I've always got a lot on my desk. I mean, I say desks, plural. I've got 3 of them around me in here as I speak to you. I keep one for fiction, and I work in that in the morning, and then I move over to what I think of as my non-fiction desk, and that's usually piled with books and material relating to the current LRB project or another non-fiction project. I've always got pieces ongoing for the LRB. They take a long time. They take a lot of work. Even the piece I've been working on in recent months, which is occasioned by a new biography of the British novelist Christopher Isherwood. I had to read all of Isherwood's novels again, read all the letters, the journals, the interviews, go back to the biography several times, read it. It's a very crisp and enjoyable biography, which I've been able to write very positively about, but it takes a lot. You know, if you're going to do it properly, it's not like tossing off a review in 600 words overnight, that some people do very brilliantly, by the way, and I have had occasion to be very grateful to those people as an author, but I'm not downing it, but it's just a different form. You know, people expect if they're reading the LRB, to really be reading a piece by somebody who's really thrown themselves in to the depths to find surprising new relationships and truths and evidence that they can bring, and jokes, obviously, that they can bring up to the surface for the reader. So, yeah, I've always got a piece on the go for the LRB, usually 3 or 4 at a time, actually, and I'm in contact with them all the time. And now I've got a broadcasting side with them, helping with podcasts and other broadcasts. I did a series of shows from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee this year, which were original broadcasts for the LRB. So it's really a full-time job that, and next to that full-time job, there's more full-time jobs because I keep my hand in contributing to the New Yorker and in 1 or 2 other places, and also, of course, mainly writing my books. And they take as much as I've got in me. I mean, they're the first thing that I start with in the morning, and I've always got research to do, and I've always got writing to do on them. So it's like having a number of jobs simultaneously. I thought as I got older that I'd work less, but the very opposite has happened. You know, I probably work 3.5 times harder than I did when I was 32. You know, it's just got more exciting, more interesting, more engaging, and, you know, I should probably settle down and slow down, but, you know, there's just too many interesting things to get on with.
I wanted to ask a bit about Scotland as we come towards the end of the interview. So before we spoke, I asked a Scottish friend of mine who's a big fan of your work, particularly Mayflies, about this. And he suggested that we should ask you about how you perceive your identity. So he said, you know, are you a Scottish writer or a British writer born in Scotland? And he wondered if you see yourself as part of this kind of extended, you know, historical tradition going back centuries of someone who's come down from Scotland and kind of positioned themselves in London society. And he also wondered about your, as he put it, aspiration to a certain cultural Milo in London. That's his words, not mine. But what he said here, and this is just, I think, quite a nice phrase, he said, partly in jest, I would be keen to know whether he secretly loathes it, or if he does not, does he secretly loathe that he does not? So consider it a question about the resilience of the Scottish shoulder chip, is the way that he put it.
It's a genius question. Full round of applause to the questioner. We could do a whole hour on this, but I'll be quick. You know, it's I've always been a great fan of the chip on the shoulder. I think it's fertile launchpad for many an essayistic stance or many a prejudice, and much comedy, by the way. I say this with a smile on my face. You know, the Scots in London has a long and noble and ignoble tradition, and I'm in a long line of Scots who came south. I have to say very unapologetically. I can't remember the exact phrase there, but, you know, ambitions to enter the London social milieu. I don't think it was ever an ambition. I think it's something that I wasn't afraid of happening, you know, because you're drawn in to the life of literary journalism and publishing and television and radio. I mean, supremely unshy, by the way, I am about that. I feel that it's as much Scottish, you know, as it is British. I feel, you know, that we built the BBC, we Scots, just as much as we contributed to the literary scene, to the life of the novel in Britain, to the life of the poetry scene. You know, I don't see it as being an either-or situation. I mentioned ambivalence before. I'm probably riding a high wave of ambivalence when it comes to all this. I'm a surfboard maniac at the top of a wave breaking for the shore when it comes to feeling both Scottish and British at the same time. I'm a Scottish writer who has had a whole career in Britain. And again, without any sense of fear about that, it just happens to be the polity that surrounds me as I go about my business as a writer. But I'm Scottish in my language, I'm Scottish in my childhood experience and my education. A lot of my tics and habits as a writer I have in common with some of my Scots peers and colleagues. But on top of that, I have a great interest in London as a place, not only as a social and economic fact, but just as a great city in the world. You know, I'm the sort of person who'd be really interested in Paris or Madrid or Barcelona, or, you know, Rome and New York, and I have been interested in all those places. I like big cities with a huge social mix. So, you know, it's no repudiation of Glasgow or Edinburgh to say that I love London. I insist on having them all and being a child of them all, if you like. So, great question. I wish we had more time for it, but it's a cheeky, brilliant question about chip in the shoulder, because my character, Campbell Flynn, in Caledonian Road, probably has a chip in his shoulder, the depth of Loch Ness. But part of his struggle, I think, is to deal with unresolved material from his Glaswegian past. I must say he's much more in trouble and I think in self-doubt about that than I've ever been. I had to sort of invent that for him. But, you know, we've been on similar paths, so it gives me a lot to think about. But it's all very rich material as far as I'm concerned. Scotland, London, Britain, you know, it's the stuff of writing.
Very much so. As a final question from me, I wanted to ask about the TV adaptations of your work. Mayflies was adapted by the BBC and Caledonian Road is in the works. How involved are you in those projects?
I'm very involved, actually. I mean, it was great, the experience of working on Mayflies for the BBC. The production company, Synchronicity Films, are based in Glasgow. And that whole production team, including the person who adapted it, are Scottish. They were, like me, deeply interested in the idea of Scotland, Britain, Manchester, the relationship between many of the parts of these islands, and the energy that they brought to the screen was very contemporary and very kind of inclusive, I thought. And I served as an executive producer on that show, and that can mean everything or nothing. And sometimes it's just a vanity thing, you know, for people to have that title. But it wasn't in this case, because it was all hands to the pump. You know, I was helping them think about locations, casting, threw in a few lines to the script whenever Andrea Gibb, the brilliant scriptwriter, needed a hand. You know, I was all over it with them because they needed the help. We were doing it to a very tight deadline. And it looks like something of the same sort will happen with Caledonian Road, which is an American production, but much bigger. It's looking to be a returning series. 60 characters, a huge cast, huge financial project. You know, it's just going to involve a lot more, really. It's a huge undertaking. And so far, they've asked me to be at the centre of it and to be involved again in quite a big way. So I'm very happy to do that. I love learning new things, and I love supporting and giving new life to those things that started as blank pages here with me. You know, I feel a sense of sort of almost parental ownership over these characters and what happens to them. So I'll do everything I can, you know. But it looks exciting at the moment because they're scaling it up in quite a big way.
Great. Well, look, thank you, Andrew, for being such a fascinating and wide-ranging guest, and wishing you all the best with Caledonian Road and with everything else going forward.
Thank you so much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Andrew O'Hagan. He's on Instagram at Andrew O'Hagan Author, and Caledonian Road is published by Faber and Faber.
Attention listeners of Always Take Notes. We're doing a series of live events this summer, and we'd love to see you there.
First up, we'll be speaking to Jojo Moyes at Hay Festival on May 29th. Jojo's novels, which include Me Before You, The Last Letter from Your Lover, and The Girl You Left Behind, have sold more than 50 million copies worldwide.
Next up is Frank Close, a theoretical physicist and the author of Trinity and Elusive. His new book, Destroyer of Worlds, is a history of the nuclear age. We'll be chatting to him at EA Festival on June 15th.
And finally, on July 3rd, we'll be speaking to Jessie Armstrong at the London Library. Jessie is the multi-award-winning screenwriter behind Peep Show, The Thick of It, and Succession.
Go to alwaystakenotes.com to buy tickets and find out more.
Before we continue with the rest of the outro, we have another supporter of the podcast on the crowdfunding site Patreon to thank. This is Kate Armstrong. She says, I've recently made a complete career shift to writing after leaving a long-term corporate career. I'm doing some journalism, and I'm delighted just to have won runner-up at the Bridgeport Memoir Award for an as-yet unagented and highly story-driven memoir about catastrophic grief, collapse, recovery, and big mountains. My website is katearmstrong.net. Kate, we really appreciate your support for the podcast and wishing you all the best with that book project. Anyway, Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Andrew O'Hagan?
I thought Andrew was such a warm and fun and enjoyable guest on the show. I loved the story he told about typing out Solzhenitsyn and trying to edit the prose, or being tempted to edit the prose. And I thought the humour he talked about as being part of the LRB DNA was very evident in his piece about Assange. If anyone hasn't read it, they should. There's lots of very funny details in there. I mean, my main takeaway was that I found it very heartening that he said he finds his work more enjoyable now than he did when he was 32. So as a 31-year-old, I'm delighted to hear it. It only gets better. How about you?
I thought he was a very gracious man, actually. Great to have him on the show. We've wanted to have him on for a long time. I thought it was particularly interesting him talking about writing fiction and non-fiction, often in the form of these big LRB essays, but he's also written a non-fiction book to a very high standard. And I also find the idea of like trying to execute the kind of quote-unquote city novel is fascinating. Bonfire of the Vanities, the big 1980s New York book by Tom Wolfe, was a hugely important book for me growing up. And I think it's fascinating, but also challenging to try and do that in London. And yeah, I thought he was kind of warm and interesting and quite thoughtful when we pushed him on the question of just how Scottish he is now, given he lives in Primrose Hill. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been reading and what have you been up to otherwise?
I was also just going to say the other thing that struck me from the interview was just how readily he was able to quote and cite other authors like Gaskell and Dickens. And I liked his idea of renovating writers who have come before. What have I been up to? I have been editing the section still, which is sort of putting a lot of my own writing on pause, but that's absolutely fine. I have been watching 4 Seasons on Netflix, which is created or co-written by Tina Fey, maybe both, not sure, which is very light and fun. My sweet spot after a long day is like a 20-minute comedy. It's great. And I've also been reading books by Frank Close ahead of our interview with him. And by the time this goes out, I will have come back from 4 days at Cannes Film Festival. So I hope to have seen lots of exciting forthcoming films. By then, we'll have to report back in the episode after this one. How about you, Simon? I
finished my kind of little magazine sabbatical in that I had to take some time out from working on my book to get 2 drafts done, which were good. It was quite pressurized, but I got both of them done and they're kind of moving forward. So now I'm in the final stretch of the book, which involves a lot of cutting, which I always find quite challenging. That's going okay. I am continuing to read rather slowly this very linguistically challenging German book about avalanches, which is actually amazing, but I'm doing 20 pages a day and having to look up quite a lot of vocab, but that's okay. And in TV, I've been watching, I'm writing this thing about Benjamin Vedrine, who's a French alpinist, and I'm having to watch enjoying watching a lot of his kind of films that he makes about his various mountain exploits, which are obviously a sort of genre in and of themselves. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.